Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Miss Horton, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Hello, my name is Sarah Bax Horton, and I'm the author of One-Armed Jack, Uncovering the Real Jack the Ripper.
And now, how'd you come across the Jack the Ripper case? Did you have an interest in it, or was it just something that you thought would be cool to write about?
In early 2017, I was doing some family history research, and I discovered by chance that my great-great-grandfather, Harry Garrett, was a Metropolitan Police Sergeant who had worked on the original Jack the Ripper investigation. And I was so thrilled as a former police volunteer myself and delighted to find out this very special historical connection that I went to the Metropolitan Police Museum and Archives for further information and gathered enough inspiration to start writing my first book.
Did you know about this connection beforehand? No family members bothered mentioning it to you at all?
But the untold story is that my grandfather was illegitimate. And when I found out who his biological parents were, that was the connection to my police ancestor, which I then verified through doing a DNA test, which linked me to descendants of Harry in North America.
What were you able to learn about his time on the case?
I was able to learn a huge amount about the social context, the way the police conducted their investigations, and so on. However, my only real link between my ancestor and the case is the fact that he was stationed at Ripper headquarters, meaning Lemon Street Police Station in Whitechapel, and all men employed there and in that division would have worked on the investigation because it lasted almost a decade. And the police in that division was so overworked that they were continually calling in reinforcements from other divisions. So we can say quite clearly that he worked on the case. I don't have anecdotes to relate to you relating to his time in Whitechapel, other than that he helped to save 11 members of a family from a house fire and certainly saved their lives, for which he received a commendation from the police commissioner of the day. And he also received a small reward, as well as a certificate and a guinea for the Royal Society for the Protection of Life from Fire.
Now, what were you using for source material when it came to just understanding? Were you just looking at events that were happening at the police station at the time of the Ripper case? If you didn't have any journals or anything that you could have looked after to tell what his thought process or anything was like that at the time.
I don't have any compelling new information originating from my police ancestor. I do have a photograph of him, which is of great personal interest to me and is actually featured in my book. What is available is the remainder of the police files on what was called the Whitechapel Murders, which cover 11 unsolved, unexplained deaths in the Whitechapel area in a reasonably broad period of time, of which at least 5 are typically attributed to Jack the Ripper, and in my analysis, 6. So we do have official papers from both the Metropolitan and City of London police because they are two separate forces. The City of London police cover the square mile, what you might call our modern day financial district, and the Metropolitan police cover the rest of London. What's also available are newspaper reports. The newspapers often reported the inquests into the women's deaths almost verbatim, which is the most amazing record because nobody was ever charged with the murders nor went to trial. And we also have, of great interest to me, given my prime suspect, workhouse and medical records, for example, from the lunatic asylums in the parlance of the day, which have clearly provided me with the only evidenced case for a prime suspect as Jack the Ripper ever.
I want to ask about the prime suspect, but I also want to ask, you mentioned six victims. I think everyone knows about the canonical five, and then some people believe I've heard before there was a couple killings before, maybe two, and then there were some afterwards. And depending on if you think he traveled to the United States, you can attribute some there. So I'm curious, what was the six for you, and how did you come to this conclusion that there was probably six that linked to a suspect?
For me, the sixth victim is actually the first in a series of six, which is Martha Tabram. And she was a casual prostitute who was found stabbed 39 times in the stairway of a tenement building in the centre of Whitechapel, just off Whitechapel Road. And although the modus operandi of her murder was different from the Ripper murders, which typically involved murder by the cutting of the throat and abdominal mutilations and the occasional removal of bodily organs, Martha's was different. However, there are several circumstances which lead me to believe I'm sort of over 50% on it. I can't give it a sort of firm attribution. However, one is her as a victim type. She exactly fits the type of woman in whom Jack the Ripper was interested. Secondly, location, not only its prime location of the murder in Whitechapel, but also if you do a geographical profile of the five murder locations, they suggest that Jack the Ripper resided in Flower and Dean Street, which was the heart of the red light district. If you add Martha Tabram in, the focus moves west into Wentworth Court, which is where my prime suspect, East End cigar maker Hyam Hyams, was living at the time. And so for me, she is a perfect addition to that canon.
Now, since it's the first killing, did you think maybe the whole motive for the throat being cut and organs taken out were just because it was the first time and he wasn't as new or maybe fresh when it came to experience and killings? I mean, there's the double event we know about, and it seems like that really only happened because he got caught or he almost got caught in the middle of his process. And then when he fled, he came across another person and still did not get what we would call his goal accomplished. And that can lead to the double event. So with the first event, if there are some like simple things like, being a prostitute or a lady of the night, those all fit certain categories where it seems kind of like Jack the Ripper, but just there's some slight differences. Could that just be because it was the first kill?
I think what is very interesting about this first killing, just to mention that serial killers tend to kill extremely close to their own home. It's somewhere where they feel very comfortable and very familiar, which may seem counterintuitive to us. And in fact, Hyam Hyams lived within 2 minutes' walk of George Yard and the Martha Tabram murder location. And the other thing to say in answer to your question is that the stairway was extremely dark. And in a dark environment where you're wishing to immobilize and kill your victim, repeated violent stabbing all over the body did achieve his aim. And so that was the first killing, I believe. And I think he then worked out that it was much more beneficial and quicker to do a very fast blitz-style attack whereby he suffocated or strangled them with his hands, pushed them to the ground, and cut their throat very quickly. And there was no other location that was as dark and possibly difficult to deal with as that stairway at George Yard.
When did you first come across Hyam? Like, how did you know this could be a candidate? Besides his location, was there certain features and were you able to learn about his personality? I noticed a lot of people that have suspects, they bring up mental backgrounds. I've heard like schizophrenia mentioned a couple of times, which it's not very open today. People don't talk about ever having schizophrenia, but back then it seemed like a lot of people's suspects covered with some mental health disorders, which I think a lot of people attribute to the brutality of the crimes.
So I was looking for a suspect who met a particular profile. As I believe other interviewees may have mentioned to you, CID Chief of the Day, Sir Robert Anderson, went public in 1910 with a published memoir and newspaper interviews to say that Jack the Ripper had been identified without the shadow of a doubt. However, owing to a reluctant witness who refused to testify in court, the suspect could not be prosecuted, and they ended their days in a lunatic asylum. Anderson gave certain identifying details about this man without naming him. And he didn't name him because of fear of the laws of libel, because, as I say, it was not possible, owing to a lack of evidence, to prosecute the man. And what Anderson said was that it was a Polish or Ashkenazi Jew, an East Ender, living in the immediate vicinity of the murder locations, who, when the mania or paroxysms, meaning fits, came upon him, was driven to kill, that there was a reluctant witness who refused to testify against him. And as I say, he ended his days in a lunatic asylum. And these concepts were backed up by the head of the Ripper investigation, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. And 3 locations were mentioned, very specific and geographically dispersed, where Jack the Ripper was held: Stepney Workhouse, Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, and Stone Lunatic Asylum in Dartford in Kent. And my prime suspect, Hyam Hyams, was held uniquely at all 3 locations. You asked about medical files. I was extremely lucky. Serendipity was on my side because in 2013 and 2015, the Colney Hatch Asylum records were released to the public. And as I've explained, I started researching the case seriously in 2017. I discovered Anderson's theory. I started profiling this unnamed suspect, and I looked among the writings of, among other Ripper experts, Keith Skinner, who I was fortunate enough to meet very early on in my own research, and who was always totally supportive of my endeavours. And what I discovered is that Keith and others had identified among these Polish Jew suspects, of which there are a few, Hyam Hyams. I went to the London archives, found these newly released files, and in them I discovered a very distinctive looking man with distinctive physical characteristics, who not only matched the profile that I drew up from Anderson, Swanson, and others, but also matched the eyewitness accounts in the case. And as you've mentioned, had very pronounced psychological issues. He was certified insane. He was a chronic alcoholic, and he suffered from severe alcohol withdrawal syndrome, which can cause hallucinations. And he was a severe epileptic, and he was recorded as being extremely violent and dangerous within a period of days after fitting. And those periods of time may well fit with the periodicity of the Ripper murders, which have been the subject of some debate. So I'm the only person in history to have an evidenced suspect as Jack the Ripper, because there are distinctive physical characteristics such as a stiff arm and a peculiar gait or way of walking, whereby he was unable to fully bend or extend his legs. And these characteristics, as well as the physical description, age 35, broad shouldered, stout, about 5'7.5", and so on, are an exact fit as well.
Now, you with one arm Jack, that name, where did he have? Was he missing an arm, or did he just have an arm that didn't work? Because I mean, with the brutality of the killings, it makes you wonder if he. I mean, how could he do that if he had one arm to use?
In February 1888, he broke his left elbow. And by the time of the murders that August, his arm would have healed, but it says in his medical records that he was unable to fully bend or extend it. So it hadn't healed with full mobility, although he could use it. And in my analysis, this explains his very fast blitz style attacks, whereby, because of his not wholly functioning left arm, he was very keen to take the women out of action quickly to avoid their self-defense.
I guess what was challenging for you looking at some of the files and trying to like did they explain certain things about his mental history when it came to why he was being incarcerated at different asylums? I know you mentioned alcoholism and you mentioned a few other things, but like specific actions, things that would seem like that they would definitely fit more of someone that was a disturbed person who would fit the category for these crimes.
He was twice admitted into asylums for very violent attacks on his wife. There was one attack with what was called a chopper, whereby he missed his wife and hit his mother. And there was another violent attack on his wife. And he seemed to favor bladed instruments. And those are the two attacks which, the second of which got him incarcerated for the rest of his life, because under monitoring in a high security asylum, he was not considered to have improved in his mental health. And he did spend the rest of his life in an asylum. And he first came to police attention in December 1888, was in and out of medical facilities until late August 1889. And from then on, he was permanently in secure medical facilities. And in my analysis, this is why the killings stopped, because in December 1888, he started to come to direct police attention.
Now, you mentioned before about the police. I guess that they've been, I think we've talked about it a bit off air, but they were heavily scrutinized. I mean, examining it from like a police perspective, do you think that they did more to help the case or hurt the case? Because obviously, depending on whose books or autobiographies you'll end up reading, they could have a suspect in mind. I think there was the McNaughton memorandum that talked about three different names on there. And there's a lot of, I've noticed now with certain individuals where it seems like they either went to private investigating after they got out and they went and kind of still followed the case, but they had suspects in mind. And it leaves a lot of people to start theorizing onto names. You're the first person that brought a suspect up that I haven't came across on a list of suspects' names before, at least open on a forum or discussion platform.
I mean, in terms of criticism of the police, I looked at this very closely and I tried not to be biased because of my police ancestor. And I was aware that there had been even contemporary criticisms made. For example, did they investigate the murders sufficiently thoroughly, given the fact that the women were prostitutes? Could there be any criticism that the police did not act, to the highest standards of ethics? I didn't find that at all. I found that the society of the day and the authorities, including the police, were horrified by this series of murders, and they worked extremely hard to try to stop them because, of course, they were ongoing, and the fight was to save the next life. And they must have been devastated to lose a series of women to the same hand in quite a tight geographical area. But unfortunately, Whitechapel was extremely densely populated and full of very narrow passageways. It's been described like a maze. And it not only facilitated the killer's escape, but also enabled him to take his victims to very quiet, dark, secluded places where they believed they were going, with him as their client. And in fact, this is not what occurred. So I can't see any sort of criticism of the police that would be valid. They were working extra hours of their own volition, and they were putting their hands in their pockets to give the street women a few pennies to get them into a lodging house for the night where they would be safe. And they urged the women not to take risks and so on. And their investigative techniques were thorough by the standards of the day without fingerprinting or forensics. And today we are so lucky to have all forms of geolocation and CCTV. But what they did have in terms of questioning witnesses, questioning suspects, investigating and checking the streets, searching the railway line in the case of Polly Nichols, and so on. They did all of this to a great degree of thoroughness, and they were held to account not only by the Home Office, which was their masters, but also by the public through the press and through the intervention of members of Parliament. And even Queen Victoria herself wrote into Scotland Yard to say, what are you doing? Are your detectives doing a good enough job? Have you searched the ships at London docks? Could it be a sailor? Again, looking at the periodicity of the murders, could it be someone coming in on a ship, killing the women, on a night out, and then departing in a way that was almost undetectable?
What did you think about the Gold Street um, thing scandal, or kind of cover up with the whole message that was written on the wall? Do you think that was positive for the case, or do you think it was negative? Because obviously that comes up of some criticism towards Sir Charles Warren, but I think with him stepping down and later other people being in charge, I think it's more of a reflection on him as the officer, not the police force as a whole.
This is a very good point. We did have some physical evidence relating to the double event, which was the night in September 1888 when two women were killed within 45 minutes of one another. And the killer, on his escape route, deposited the torn and bloodied corner of the victim, Catherine Eddowes' apron, and some scrawled up words of protest written in chalk in a doorway of a tenement block at Goulston Street, which was extremely near Wentworth Street, and in fact would be on the way home between Mitre Square, the murder location, and my prime suspect, Hyam Hyams' home at Wentworth Court. So the police, in the early hours after the double event, they found these two items and clearly considered them to be highly significant, not least because the torn corner of the apron was taken to the mortuary and it matched the missing corner of Catherine Eddowes' apron, which was still on her body at that time. So what the police did was the words of protest, which is called a graffito, could not remain at what would be the centre of the Jewish market on a Sunday morning. And unfortunately, they didn't wait for it to be photographed. And had they photographed the graffito, we would have a sample of Jack the Ripper's handwriting, which it would be possible to match, for example, to a signature on a marriage certificate. And many of the suspects did leave behind evidence of their own handwriting. We don't have this, and it was washed away with a sponge and a bucket of water. Now, in hindsight, we can criticise the police for this, and they probably should have waited to photograph it. However, there was great sort of fear and resentment on the streets of Whitechapel about this serial killer. And there were starting to be recriminations against different groups in the community. And the police genuinely feared violence or even fatalities on the streets of Whitechapel relating to bad feeling. And as I say, this sense of fear and a sort of vigilante sentiment. And so I think we can understand why they did that. And had they not, and there had been any sense of injury or indeed death resulting, of course, they would have been even more criticised, and quite rightly so.
With all the murders, it gets mentioned that it seemed like the suspect or whoever did them had surgical knowledge. Did you come across anything with him being a cigar maker or anything that would show that he had utensils or equipment or anything type of expertise? Because you can look at like surgical knowledge can mean a doctor or a professor or someone has some type of medical experience, or it could be a butcher. So I'm wondering if there was anything in specific where he would have gotten materials or the type of precision blades or anything to be able to do the type of cuts that would match the wounds on the victims.
I discuss this in my book. I talk about the manual dexterity and the knife that would be needed to make cigars by hand at that time. I also consider that most people would have had a far greater knowledge of domestic butchery than we have nowadays, because that would have been necessary. And I also talk about rather prurient waxworks, which were available for viewing on the streets of Whitechapel, in which women's bodies were shown, including their organs and so on, which was allegedly for the viewing of gentlemen and medical students, but which was quite obviously for titillation. And we know that the police and the police surgeons of the day were totally convinced that the killer had no anatomical knowledge. And indeed, there are two very interesting criminal profiles which have been done about Jack the Ripper, which I discuss in my book. And the first was probably the first ever criminal profile done by senior police surgeon Thomas Bond at the request of CID Chief Robert Anderson. And Bond said that this was probably a quiet, inoffensive man who had periodical attacks of erotic and homicidal mania because the attacks were sexually motivated. And we can say that quite clearly because of the focus on the abdomen and the type of gratification that is derived from mutilating women's bodies. And again, he said no anatomical knowledge. And interestingly, 100 years later, the FBI did a profile of Jack the Ripper, which is an extremely close match, again, to my prime suspect, Hyam Hyams. And what they say, which I find fascinating, is that the killer had some physical abnormality, scarring, or speech problem that he perceived as psychologically crippling. And in my book, I link the lack of control and lack of confidence and sheer mental and physical illness derived from Hyam's severe epilepsy. And I do link that with part of his motivation to kill, because it was not possible to treat epilepsy in any measurable or significant way in the late Victorian period.
What about his personality would have liked to find out that maybe you didn't have an answer to? Obviously, it'd be really cool if he had like a secret diary that was like, oh yeah, by the way, I was Jack the Ripper on the side or something. But if there was anything for you during your research that you felt there just wasn't evidence or there wasn't something about him as a person, because you're learning more about him, you're becoming more attached to him as a person. I'm just curious if there was something about his personality or anything that you had a question about, or was maybe kind of left up in the air because you just don't have the facts for.
The medical records are comprehensive, and we know that Hyam's wife cooperated with the authorities, and much of the information which she provided was written into his medical record in an attempt to help him and give him better treatment. And what she said is that he was, when in his normal health, he was quiet, civil, and attentive to his personal appearance. And this idea of being sort of quiet and neat is replicated in both of the criminal profiles that I've just referred to. His wife did call him kind and industrious when in usual health. However, when he was having his periods of fitting and this very nasty aftermath, he was described as dangerous, treacherous, tearing his sheets and painting the walls with excrement, committing violent attacks on his wife when she visited him, fellow inmates, and medical staff, including one with a sharpened piece of metal on the neck of a medical officer. And his wife also explained that her husband had the delusion that she was unfaithful to him with men, including her own, I beg your pardon, his own brothers. She said that she had suffered 4 miscarriages and claimed to live in fear of her husband's violence. He suffered from paranoia, believing his food was poisoned, and he was on occasion force-fed. He believed that his wife and a certain Dr. Long had somehow caused his epilepsy, which came on in adulthood. And he had a terror of the police, whom he believed were following him. And we know from Chief Inspector Donald Swanson and also to City of London police officers who also went into writing on this subject that Jack the Ripper was followed by plainclothes detectives for a 3-month period. And I have Hyam Hyams at liberty for a 3-month period between January and April 1889, which I believe fits well with this surveillance operation.
Oh, it makes it sound a lot like the Jekyll and Hyde theory. I don't know if you've ever heard that about a Mr. Jekyll and Hyde. When you started describing his being in these fits and having this kind of freak out, it makes it seem like it does sound like I understand where I think there's one investigator that thought there was two people, that it was committed by multiple people. And I think you could get that, especially if someone has like what seems like almost a split personality.
Yeah, I mean, I think the medical records are compelling, and it's also the physical descriptions and these peculiar characteristics which map so well onto the eyewitness accounts and also onto the profiles and what was said by the officers of the day, who all claimed that the case had been solved without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, I know some people from Scotland Yard had named Aaron Kosminski as one of these, and that's from Russell Edwards, I believe. He said that the record said that Scotland Yard named Aaron, but I don't know. It's so strange because I've never like maybe it's just different today, but back then it seemed like everyone kind of fit the profile of Jack the Ripper when you really start examining the number of people that were experiencing some type of inner conflict or had some type of background or expertise that could honestly fit some of the murders. I mean, the issue really stems from, I think, the fact that nobody really probably cared as much because they were prostitutes in the beginning until it started getting kind of out of hand. The first one could just be like, all right, we can just move on. And then that's kind of the second one. But then when did they really start paying attention?
Yeah, I mean, I do find this a very interesting point, which I discuss in my book, because the first one or two murders, depending on how you count them, but let's say they're Martha Tabram and Polly Nichols, they were actually unwitnessed. So we neither had witnesses seeing a man accost either of the women, nor did we see anyone seeing anyone acting suspiciously afterwards. So we don't have any witnesses. And in Martha's case, it could be argued that a friend of hers hooked up with her and two soldiers, and then they each went off with a separate soldier. However, that was possibly a couple of hours before the murder of Martha actually took place. So I discount that as being a witness sighting, and there were no other sightings. So for the first two murders, the police actually had no leads, despite extensive questioning, searching, and investigations. They also started to appeal to the public for information, but they had nothing to work on until the murder of Annie Chapman, in which she was seen being accosted by a man immediately before her murder. And an eyewitness saw a man running away from the scene of the crime afterwards. And it's then that the police really start to have some traction on the case. And if you like, I could talk a little bit more about those two witnesses.
I do, because I want to ask you about, you mentioned the witness, and I've noticed this is kind of like controversial territory in the whole case, but some people don't believe that there was a witness because maybe he stepped forward, I think, when they were it was later on when they were, guess I forgot what the word is for it, but it made me wonder, do you believe the witness that said that he saw, I forgot which murder it was. Maybe you could refresh my memory, but I think you know the one I'm talking about, because I honestly tend to believe the guy and understand it's weird he came out later with it, but I don't know. I mean, you have to think of it at the time as well, too. I mean, that's a very drastic scenario. A lot of people, if you were in a situation like that, probably wouldn't step forward until there was questions being brought around.
I believe that you're referring to the witness in the Mary Jane Kelly case. She was the youngest victim, probably aged around 24, and her body was the most mutilated in what we can see as being an escalation in violence. And also because she had a private room and her killer was not interrupted. This witness is a man called George Hutchinson, who knew Mary Jane Kelly well. So there was no doubt as to his identification of her. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, very close to the probable time of her murder, George Hutchinson saw Kelly being tapped on the shoulder, quite literally, by a man outside a pub on Commercial Street. And they had a conversation. And he said something which made her laugh. Then he asked her a question, and Mary Jane said, "Come along, dear, you will be comfortable." So she's inviting him back to her room. She's lost her handkerchief. He gives her one. And they're having this perfectly pleasant conversation, and they're walking back to Mary Jane Kelly's private room at Miller's Court. Now, George Hutchinson witnesses this, and some researchers have suggested that he was Mary Jane Kelly's pimp. And this is why he's so interested that she has a client, is going to earn some money. And he actually hangs around the street sort of opposite the entrance to the courtyard where she lived. He actually waited for maybe 20 minutes, hoping the man would come out and maybe seeking to elicit some money from Mary Jane. What actually happened was that George Hutchinson got a very good look at the man, gave up waiting, and so her body was not then discovered until about 10 o'clock in the morning. What George Hutchinson saw was a man who did match the description of Hyam Hyams, so a man of Jewish appearance, in his mid-30s, wearing dark clothing, and probably slightly more smartly dressed than we are used to from the other eyewitnesses in the Jack the Ripper case, who described a man who was shabby genteel, so wearing quality clothing, but that was sort of second, third, fourth hand, so very well worn. Whereas George Hutchinson seemed to be describing a much smarter individual. And I researched this, and I did discover a coincidence between big horse racing days and the Ripper murders. And in my book, I debate whether Jack the Ripper dressed up a little bit to go to the races and was a gambler in addition to his other vices. But I certainly give George Hutchinson great credibility because the police of the day did. And they were very rigorous about the witnesses whom they accepted or did not accept, and also their suspects. If they brought a man in for questioning and he was able to explain himself adequately, and the police were able to check those facts, they would release him very quickly. And there was no sense that they were holding suspects to make themselves look better in the eyes of the waiting world.
Now, I mentioned that witness, but you were talking about two other ones. Could you maybe describe what you were mentioning before I kind of interjected with the Mary Jane Kelly one?
Well, the case of Annie Chapman has two very credible eyewitnesses, and they're really the first leads that the police have in the whole investigation. A woman called Elizabeth Long was on her way to work, walking along Hanbury Street, and outside 29 Hanbury Street, in the backyard of which Annie Chapman's dead body would shortly be discovered, she saw a man and a woman leaning against the window shutters at the front of the house. And unfortunately for us, Mrs. Long said she did not see the man's face. She only saw that he was taller than the woman and wearing dark clothing, specifically a dark brown hat and a coat. However, they were conversing loudly, and the man said to the woman, "Will you?" And the woman said, "Yes." And what's interesting about this is that the timing is literally the minutes before the murder. And we know that for the witnesses, the police took them to the mortuary to view the women's bodies to make sure that the man being reported was talking to the witness. And so we can say categorically that Mrs. Long was a good witness, and she gave a sort of shape and a perception of the man without seeing his face. And this is sort of like a critical lost opportunity in the Ripper case. But of course, she didn't know what she was seeing. And then one of my favourite witnesses immediately after the Annie Chapman murder is a man called John Thimbleby, who, like Mrs. Long, was walking along the same street on his way to work. And at 6 o'clock that morning, before he'd heard of the murder, he saw a man who attracted his particular attention walking, almost running down Hanbury Street towards Brick Lane with a peculiar gait, not bending his legs as he walked. And it is that viewing of a man of a particular, again, age, ethnicity, appearance, but with the peculiar gait, which was typical of Hyam Hyams, that I believe is the first evidential sighting of Jack the Ripper.
Through your work in the case, what has been the most difficult thing for you? I mean, has it been interacting with the whole ripperology community? I look at the JFK case because it's kind of similar in the terms of the community aspect of things. Everyone's got an independent theory, and it's kind of a little bit difficult. But I've noticed there's a lot of controversial areas in the case if you're new to it. And there's a lot of things you kind of have to look over and you have to kind of get all perspectives on. But I was more interested in the researchers like yourself that have done work in certain areas. And I'm curious, what would be the biggest challenge for you out of all your research?
In the beginning, because there are so many theories about the case, I found it very difficult to work out what the underlying evidence was or how to substantiate these different ways of thinking. And I just went back to what the police of the day said, which took me straight back to CID Chief Robert Anderson and his senior officer, Donald Swanson, and what other senior detectives said about the case being solved and who the criminal actually was. So the first thing was clarity of thinking. And another difficulty that I had was that because the official papers on the case are incomplete, so they've been bombed in the Second World War, weeded out, destroyed, stolen, lost, you name it. And so there are some things which we really don't know and will probably never know. And among them are truly who were the police suspects in 1888 and beyond. We don't have a complete list. What we derive now is from reading newspaper reports, is from finding stray comments, marginalia, remarks made in newspaper interviews and so on by the police of the day. We don't really know the number of victims. I do believe it's six. I do follow the theory of the canonical five. Again, without forensics, we can only observe what the police surgeon said and the veracity that the police placed on those medical reports. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have Jack the Ripper's handwriting, although we came very close to having it there, which is such an interesting point. And in my analysis, we probably don't have DNA or anything else which would enable a firm identification of anyone.
Well, Ms. Horton, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links to your books, to any social media profiles, or anything website that you would like to share with the audience out there listening?
I am active on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. And my books, including my second book, Arm of Eve, about the Thames Torso murders, are widely available, including on Amazon.
Well, I'll make sure I can find any links for you, put it in the description below so people listening can be able to click. And I do appreciate the time you gave me to talk about the case and some of the research that you have done. And it's greatly appreciated too. Coming at the game a little bit late. I know a lot of people say it's like, it's a 100-year-old or over case, but there's a good time to start anywhere, I guess. And I'm very appreciative of you and other researchers that have given me the time. And thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.